So here we are now at video number 72. And we've been discussing Jerusalem, both the old Jerusalem and the new Jerusalem during the time of the end. And hopefully I've convinced the audience that yes, there is a spiritual old Jerusalem during the time of the end that's very much connected to the rulers of the people in Jesus Christ's kingdom, the rulers who make a covenant with death. Millions now living will never die. So I've also brought out that this old Jerusalem that becomes heaps of ruins is immediately prior or exists at the same time as the new Jerusalem is being built. So hopefully that's what my audience got out of the last couple of videos I've made. So I'd like to talk a little more about the old Jerusalem and what we can expect to happen to it. And I'm going to start again in Isaiah chapter 66 verse 5, and hopefully the audience that's been following along in this video series will understand why I do this, even though I'm certain you're so familiar now with that scripture. The reason I do it is because I expect there will be new people who see this video and need to understand these things. So you need to bear with me if you've been following along. I'm going to read that scripture again. Listen carefully if you're just joining this video series at video number 72. It's in Isaiah chapter 66 verse 5, and everyone in Christianity agrees that this chapter, the last chapter of the book of Isaiah, is an end-time scripture. Listen carefully. Hear the word of Jehovah, you men who are trembling at his word. Your brothers that are hating you, that are excluding you by reason of my name, said, may Jehovah be glorified. He must also appear with rejoicing on your part, and they are the ones that will be put to shame. And so if you're a Jehovah's Witness who's never listened to this video series before, hopefully you understand that this is a scripture that can only be fulfilled by disfellowshipped Jehovah's Witnesses. Name of person is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses, excluding you by reason of my name. So, but what about the old Jerusalem, the one that ends up in heaps of ruins? Well, let's keep reading now in Isaiah chapter 66 and the next verse, verse 6. There is a sound of uproar out of the city, a sound out of the temple. It is the sound of Jehovah repaying what is deserved to his enemies. So, where are God's enemies? They're in the city. And this city has a temple, Jerusalem. So, in Isaiah 66 verse 5, it says, your brothers that are hating you, they're the ones that will be put to shame. And so they are the enemies that Jehovah will repay. And they are in the old Jerusalem that will become heaps of ruins. So now I'm going to go to verse 15 in the same chapter, chapter 66, which all of Christianity believe is an end-time scripture. Listen carefully to verse 15. For here Jehovah himself comes as a very fire, and his chariots are like a storm wind, in order to pay back his anger with sheer rage, and his rebuke with flames of fire. For as fire, Jehovah himself will for a fact take up the controversy, yes, with his sword, against all flesh. So this goes beyond just Old Jerusalem. Now he's talking about the whole world. Against all flesh. And the slain of Jehovah will certainly become many. So this has to be the great tribulation. The end. What Jehovah's Witnesses like to call the War of Armageddon. Where in fact Armageddon is actually a place. It's not a war. And you'll know that if you've followed along in this video series. So Jehovah's coming as a fire. So something's going to get burnt. The Old Jerusalem. The place where his enemies are. In that city. And also in the temple. So, does that remind you of anything? Yes. Another end-time scripture in the book of Revelation. Let's go there. So if Jehovah is going to come as fire, something's going to get burned. Right? So now I'm going to read a scripture in Revelation chapter 18. And starting in verse 9. And the kings of the earth, who committed fornication with her and lived in shameless luxury, will weep and beat themselves in grief over her when they look at the smoke from the burning of her, while they stand at a distance because of their fear of her torment, and say, too bad, you great city, Babylon, you strong city, because in 1 hour your judgment has arrived. The Old Jerusalem, Babylon the Great, will become heaps of ruins, and Jehovah will come with rage to get vengeance on his enemies who are in this city, Babylon the Great. And so, if he's coming with fire, let me read also in, I believe it's Revelation chapter 19 and verse 3. It says, and right away for the second time they said, praise Jah, you people. And the smoke from her goes on ascending forever and ever. A fire that cannot be put out. So, it's Babylon the Great. And remember in Revelation chapter 16, where we discussed Armageddon in previous videos, and the videos I invited you to watch. So, in Revelation chapter 16, one of the most important things about Armageddon is that you stay awake. And just to remind you, I'll read it. It's in Revelation chapter 16 and verse 15. immediately after or immediately before mentioning Armageddon. It says, "Look, I am coming as a thief. Happy is the one that stays awake and keeps his outer garments, that he may not walk naked, and people look upon his shamefulness." So there's two results from this. You're either happy, joyful, or shamed. So remember what it said in Isaiah chapter 66, verse 5? He must appear with rejoicing on your part, and they are the ones that will be put to shame. Happy or shamefulness. So if you've watched the Armageddon video that I invited you to watch earlier in this video series, you should be happy and awake. But let me continue reading. What does this have to do with Babylon the Great or the old Jerusalem? It says, or continues in verse 16, "And they gathered them together to the place that is called in Hebrew Armageddon." And now what happens? Listen carefully in verse 17. "And the seventh one," the seventh angel, "the seventh one poured out his bowl upon the air. At this a loud voice issued out of the sanctuary from the throne, saying, 'It has come to pass.' And lightnings and voices and thunders occurred, and a great earthquake occurred, such as had not occurred since men came to be on the earth. So extensive an earthquake, so great. And the great city split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And Babylon the Great was remembered in the sight of God to give her the cup of the wine of the anger of his wrath." So, is that starting to happen? Because remember, in Isaiah chapter 66, it says, he's going to be against all flesh. And yet, he's going to pay special attention to his enemies that are in the city that contains the temple, the old Jerusalem, Babylon the Great. And it says here, the great city split into 3 parts. And so I'll probably discuss those 3 parts in a later video. It's my conviction that those 3 parts are a sword, famine, or pestilence. And that's mentioned in the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel is asked to cut his hair and divide it into 3 parts. So this is the Jerusalem, that the old Jerusalem that will become mere heaps of ruins, and yet there's kings inside of Babylon the Great who are upset that it's been destroyed. And remember in chapter 19, there are people rejoicing over the destruction of Babylon the Great. So while some kings are upset that Babylon the Great has been destroyed and the smoke ascends forever and ever, there are others who rejoice. They praise Jehovah. And so it makes sense what it says in Revelation chapter 16. "Look, I'm coming as a thief. Happy is the one that stays awake." They'll rejoice over the destruction of this very evil and corrupted old Jerusalem where God's enemies reside. That's where the enemies of God live in the temple and in the city, the old Jerusalem. And it goes on to say, stay awake, that they may not walk naked, and people look upon his shamefulness. So the kings of the earth who are dismayed about Babylon the Great's destruction, they're the ones who will be put to shame. So this, in Revelation chapter 16, the seventh one poured out his bowl upon the air, and it's the end. It's come to pass. So for anyone doubting that we're living in the time of the end, you really need to understand what's coming. And so what's my recommendation to a Jehovah's Witness who's in that place, in Babylon the Great? Even kings of the earth who have an inheritance reserved for them in the heavens, they're still inside Babylon the Great. God's people are still in there. And so this scripture in Revelation chapter 18 is very important for my audience to help their family and their loved ones, the spiritual brothers that they've left behind in the kingdom hall, to understand. It says in verse 4 of Revelation chapter 18, and I heard another voice out of heaven say, get out of her, my people. If you do not want to share with her in her sins, and if you do not want to receive part of her plagues. And so what are those plagues? The three things: a sword, famine, and pestilence. A plague. So here, I hope my audience will admonish their family and their brothers and sisters that they've left behind, their spiritual brothers and sisters that they've left behind in the kingdom halls, to get out. And how can you help them understand they need to get out? You in turn should bear witness to all the things that have been discussed in this video series. But here's something that will definitely help God's people to get out. And it's something my audience already knows. But if you're new to this video series, listen carefully to Romans chapter 9, verse 25. Here we go. It is as he says also in Hosea, those not my people I will call my people, and her who was not beloved, beloved. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they will be called sons of the living God. So in what place was it said to them, you are not my people? Name of person is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. You are not my people. And it goes on here in Romans chapter 9, verse 27. It says, moreover, Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, although the number of the sons of Israel may be as the sand of the sea, 8 million, it is the remnant that will be saved. For Jehovah will make an accounting on the earth, concluding it and cutting it short. The great tribulation, an accounting on the earth. Remember Isaiah chapter 66? Jehovah will go forth with rage and flames of fire against his enemies, and in fact against everyone, the entire earth. Do you see the similarities in all of these scriptures? So, those not my people, I will call my people. So, if you need to get out of Babylon the Great, hopefully it's not eluding you what's necessary. You know what you have to do to get out of Babylon the Great, the old Jerusalem that will be burned up with fire, a fire that will burn forever. It cannot be put out. The smoke will ascend forever. And the people who stayed and did not get out, they'll be put to shame forever. Okay, I've decided to use Zechariah chapter 3 and verse 2. And so, this is about the New Jerusalem. Listen carefully. It says, "Then the angel of Jehovah said to Satan, Jehovah rebuke you, O Satan. Yes, Jehovah rebuke you. He who is choosing Jerusalem. Is this one not a log snatched out of the fire?" So, the inhabitants of the New Jerusalem that Jehovah chooses will be logs snatched out of the fire, out of a place of darkness, and into his wonderful light. Snatched out of the fire, a fire that cannot be put out. The New Jerusalem. And how does Jehovah choose Jerusalem? And remember, Jerusalem will be made of precious stones, men, and the temple. So we'll go back to Isaiah chapter 66, and it says, I'll remind you what it says. And these are the brothers that we're to bring with us during the time of the end, through witnessing to them. Remember what Jesus Christ said about the truth? The Spirit of the truth. You, in turn, are to bear witness. And what happens if you do bear witness? Some people will listen and understand. And it says here in Isaiah chapter 66, an end-time scripture, where it mentions brothers being excluded by reason of God's actual name. And here it is in Isaiah chapter 66, verse 21. "And from them also I shall take some for the priests, for the Levites. Jehovah has said." He will choose Jerusalem. And so, the inhabitants of the New Jerusalem will be beautified. The house of David will be rebuilt. It is being rebuilt. And how do you do that? You, in turn, are to bear witness.